Oh.
It's not just the physical injuries. You have to learn to cope with that. It's the sheer waste and the stench of alcohol that stays with you.
I'm just ringing to inform you that your daughter Lucy has been involved in a car accident. You'll need to come down.
This is probably real bad hurt, you know, a car smashed. Sure, Lucy. This is the driver.
That looks very messy.
Okay, you can't go in there at the moment, mate.
I've got to go in.
You want to come with us? We'll just have a chat to you for a second.
Sure.
She's okay. The left leg has been damaged quite severely, and there's a possibility that she may lose that leg. We'll also scan their head to look at whether there's any head injury as well.
They drink too much and then they drive. They smash up their cars and the people they're supposed to care about. And if they survive, they're the ones that have to live with that. And that's the real tragedy. If you drink, then drive, you're a bloody idiot.
Well, absolutely. Hello and welcome to yet another fabulous Coroners Court of Victoria and Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine Law Week event. I'm Brian Nankervis. I'll be your host and your moderator this evening. This will be my fourth Law Week event and I'm delighted to be here. Always challenging, always stimulating. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be watching this evening. So, we are coming to you live, online from the Forensic Meeting Room at the Southback Centre, where I'm joined by some of the most illustrious talent in the Victorian and in fact Australian legal and forensic world. To my left, I have His Honour, the State Coroner of Victoria, Judge John Cain, also Dr. Jennifer Schumann, Head of the Drug Intelligence Unit at the VIFM. To my right, I have Dr. Linda Iles, Head of Forensic Pathology at VIFM, Dr. Joanne Parkin, Clinical Forensic Physician, also from the VIFM, and Associate Professor Nicola Cunningham, a clinical forensic physician and an emergency physician from St Vincent's Hospital. Together, these experts will discuss the impact of alcohol on our daily lives and how it affects families and fatalities in areas far wider than simply the road toll. For many of us, the impact of alcohol on the community was first introduced through the Transport Accident Commission's famous campaign, "If you drink, then drive, you're a bloody idiot." Released in 1989, these ads were an education in safety and responsible alcohol consumption. We just saw the very first one. Now, more than 30 years later, they still strike at the heart of the issue. But alcohol has a direct impact on far more fatalities than just those on the road. From DIY accidents in the home to punch-ups at the pub, alcohol makes us vulnerable in so many ways. So, to kick us off, let's hear from His Honour, Judge Cain. Judge Cain, usually when we think about alcohol-related deaths, we think about the road toll. You and your fellow coroners sadly see the result of many other deaths related to alcohol. Tell us about some of these other fatalities involved.
Yes, thanks, Brian. The road toll and deaths that occur on the road are, I guess, the best known and have been through campaigns run by the TAC, have been promoted, and the community has been educated about the risks and dangers. In our roles as coroners, where we look at deaths that are reportable to us because they were potentially avoidable, you see it in a whole range of other activities. So to give you some examples, in drug overdose deaths, and in that context, alcohol is considered a drug, in those deaths, 30% of those deaths, there's an alcohol component. In drownings, there's always often alcohol's involved. Somebody decides that having drunk too much, that it's a good idea to go and have a swim. It occurs. It also provides the context in a range of other things. In family violence deaths, 40% of family violence deaths, alcohol's involved. In suicide deaths, and in this state, sadly, we have 700 suicides each year. In 30% of those, alcohol is involved. And then when you look across the other deaths that occur, whether they're the broader category of homicide deaths, or whether it's one-punch events that occur, or fights that may occur, alcohol is often part of the context. And I think that's probably the message in this. You can't, there's some deaths that are reported here where alcohol is the sole cause, where people have drunk themselves to death. But that's the smaller proportion of them. More commonly, alcohol is part of the context and the backdrop that has led to the death. And you see it and you hear about it. The term Dutch courage is often used, that people's inhibitions are reduced and they're more likely to do something stupid when they've had too much to drink. So I guess the message from coroners is that we see far too often alcohol being a contributing factor to a death, and but for the involvement of alcohol, perhaps that death might have been preventable.
John, do you think these deaths are on the increase, the numbers?
I think that the amount or the volume and the occurrence of alcohol being involved is in the increase. I think there's some evidence that people are drinking more, and it's not. Previously, people went to the pub, and the 6 o'clock swill was the big event, and that was addressed by expanding liquor hours. And I think what we saw in Melbourne arising from those early reforms in liquor is a more mature and better attitude to drinking alcohol through pubs and clubs and restaurants. I think our challenge at the moment is around the sale of packaged liquor and the consumption of that liquor in homes or in public places where there aren't restrictions on people, the amount they consume, and they have, in some senses, unfettered access to it. And I think what we're seeing is alcohol in that context being a more significant contributor to deaths occurring in our community.
Thank you. So, Dr. Iles, when someone comes into the care of the coroner and the forensic team, what actually happens?
Well, I guess when you're thinking about alcohol-related deaths, they're often reported because they might be as a result of an accident, or it might be a suicide, or they might even be natural, because deaths related to chronic alcohol abuse are actually classed as natural deaths, but they're actually unexpected at the time. So there's a range of scenarios that we might encounter. But what will happen is the police will then make the report to the coroner via the coronial admissions and inquiries. And the police, as part of that report, will furnish the coroner with information around the circumstances in which that person died, and hopefully some medical history if the police have an awareness around that. And then sometimes they'll even send in some scene photographs, which is sort of quite informative sometimes when it comes to alcohol-related deaths. The coronial admissions and inquiries staff, they'll talk with the next of kin to explain the process of what is going to happen to their loved one when they come here. And they'll also try and get a little bit of additional information from the family in terms of medical history, for example, and maybe what happened around the day that that person died. The coronial admissions and inquiry staff also try and get a bit of medical history, because that's often important when it comes to considering what is the right type of examination for this person to undergo. But when they're admitted here, they will have a full body CT scan, and they'll also have some blood drawn for toxicology studies, which in the setting of potential alcohol-related deaths, clearly the toxicology is important. So with all that information, the pathologists will sit down and consider that, and then have a meeting with the coroner, and will make a recommendation to the coroner around what is the most appropriate level of investigation required to answer the questions that the coroner is going to have. And those questions are going to be, well, first of all, what is the cause of death? But sometimes, more importantly, how death occurred. So we talked about drowning a moment ago. Drowning is the end result, but particularly when alcohol is involved, is what's caused that person to drown. So sometimes that is the question that the coroner is really asking. And also there might be some concerns that family might raise, and so the coroner has to consider what the best level of examination is to address all of those questions. And I think the coroner will also take on board the family's views about autopsy and how they feel about that, because culturally that's something that not all families agree with. But ultimately the coroner will make a decision as to the level of examination that's going to be undertaken. Now that might just be an external examination with toxicology analysis and utilising that CT scan. Or the coroner might actually recommend a full autopsy. So by that we mean an internal examination and what most people would consider an autopsy exam. So that is a full external description, and then a macroscopic look at someone's organs, and then also taking samples to look at those organs microscopically. And also we'll take some more toxicology samples for analysis. And at the end of that process, the cause of death might be evident. For example, in some alcohol-related deaths due to varices, for example, the cause of death will be evident at the time of autopsy. But in other cases, we might have to look at the results of all of those tests and integrate them together to come up with the cause of death. But once the autopsy is completed and the samples are collected, and the coroner is satisfied that the identification of that person is confirmed, then that person's body can be released to the funeral director. So even if a cause of death isn't determined at that time, that's it's no barrier for a body being released for a funeral.
What sort of effects would you expect to see from alcohol? I suppose I'm thinking about telltale signs.
I guess there's really two aspects to that question, because there's the acute effects of alcohol, but also the effects of chronic alcohol abuse. But even before you start to look at the person, you can get information from the history and from the scene, which might give you an indication that alcohol is involved. Say, for example, if somebody is found dead after having a big night out, a history of being reported that person's snoring abnormally, that gives us a bit of a hint that there's some potential central nervous system depression from alcohol, plus or minus other drugs. In a typical scene where there's lots of alcohol containers around gives you an indication that somebody may have a long-standing history with alcohol misuse. But occasionally, particularly in people who abuse alcohol over the long term, a scene can look quite alarming. So, for example, somebody who has esophageal varices and vomits blood, the scene can actually look really quite horrendous. Or a person is found covered in bruises related to easy bleeding from alcohol. All those things can initially give the appearance that someone else might be involved in that person's death, but often that isn't the case. But sometimes we get called to these scenes because there is concern that that person's been injured by somebody else. But I guess if you use specifically in looking at specific organs, obviously most people think about alcohol and liver disease. For example, someone with established liver cirrhosis, they might be jaundiced. They often will have easy bruising because they're not creating clotting factors which stop bruising from occurring. And against the varices that I mentioned, so abnormal, catastrophic, often internal bleeding, we see that not infrequently in the autopsy room. Other things that are a bit of a hint are things like gynecomastia, so developing breast tissue in men, and also testicular atrophy from chronic alcohol abuse. But thinking of other organs, for example, like the brain, so alcohol is a white matter toxin, so the brain can become atrophic due to white matter loss. Nutritional factors associated with the use of alcohol can result in injury to the cerebellum, which controls your balance and coordination. And very occasionally you can get things like Wernicke's, which result in confusion and ataxia. But it's the combination of brain shrinkage and easy bruising and bleeding combined with balance problems. And then maybe if you add a layer of acute alcohol intoxication on top of that, can be quite a disaster when it comes to traumatic brain injury. So you can, you have a propensity to bleed around the brain or even into the brain. And that's not just from accidents, but also people who abuse alcohol might be in a situation where violence is involved. So you already have somebody who's kind of vulnerable to an underlying head injury. And that's just really scratching the surface. There are many other organ systems that are involved, but we don't have all night.
Thank you, Linda. Not a pretty picture, but a realistic one. Of course, apart from deaths, alcohol has had a huge impact on violence in the community, such as the so-called coward's punch. This is a particular area of interest to you, Dr. Schumann. You've been involved in the coward's punch campaign. Tell us about that.
That's right, I have. So we've been looking at one-punch assaults in Australia as far back as 2000, and what we've found is quite staggering. We've found that there have been at least 127 Australians who have died from a one-punch assault since 2000, and this figure is actually likely to rise as we conduct further research on coronial data, which is something we're undertaking at the moment. These deaths occur almost exclusively in males, generally in their 30s, mid-30s, and it's important to remember that these are all entirely preventable deaths. Now, the link with alcohol in these deaths is quite significant. In the data, we've found that almost 3/4 of the deaths had been drinking prior to death. So the volumes of alcohol were also quite significant. The average concentration of alcohol in the blood of these individuals was around about 3 times the legal driving limit in Australia. So that provides some context of just how intoxicated these individuals were. The research has also provided an indicator of the risks associated with alcohol intoxication. So we already knew from past research that alcohol intoxication increases the risk of aggressive offending. But this data also indicated that being under the influence of alcohol also increases the risk of somebody becoming a victim of one of these violent assaults. So we're currently working with the Stop the Cowards Punch Foundation to update all of this research. So we're looking at all of the coronial data back to 2000, updating that data to 2019. We're also looking at some of the survivors of these one-punch assaults using some of our clinical forensic data here at the Institute. And we'll also be looking at the perpetrators of these assaults. So some interesting and very important new data that will be released in the coming weeks as part of the Stop the Coward Punch week, which is the first week of June.
Jen, I'm interested here, I have to say, are you seeing more public awareness of this issue?
Well, that's the positive thing. Since we first released some of this research back in 2013, there was a big public push, a lot more awareness created around the issue, education campaigns, especially with some of the families advocates, families who had lost loved ones from a one-punch assault. There's also been massive legislation changes across Australia for substance-fuelled one-punch assaults and other interventions such as lockout zones and strategies like that that have been introduced in different cities. So that's what we're hoping to see, that with all of these sorts of awareness campaigns and interventions, changes in Australian public health policy and practice, that we are going to be seeing a decrease in these deaths, and particularly in the involvement of alcohol in these sorts of tragic events.
Absolutely. And of course, a major problem with alcohol is its link with family violence, where more than 40% of incidents have alcohol as a contributing factor. Dr. Parkin, this is your area. Tell us about the impact of alcohol on family violence.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. What I'll probably will first do is tell you what clinical forensic medicine is, if that's okay.
Yes.
We're a very small faculty that aren't particularly well known in I guess, outside of the law. So in terms of what we do in Victoria specifically, because it can differ in different jurisdictions, the clinical forensic medicine or physician's role is basically to examine victims of both physical assault, sexual assault, traffic accidents and offences. We also examine perpetrators of crime. So we're looking at physical assault effects on those perpetrators of crime as well. And we examine all areas of crime in terms of fitness for interview of these particular individuals. Alcohol in itself has an effect on all of those aspects that I've just mentioned in differing degrees of its impact in that field. But in terms of you mentioning family violence, then yes, it's quite a big percentage that you mentioned there. And what we see from a clinical forensic physician role is the impact physically on individuals in terms of family violence. So we examine these individuals in terms of the injuries that they receive as a result of family violence. We document these injuries and then we go to court to present these injuries there. So unlike Linda, who is working on those that pass away, we are working on the living and looking at specific type of injuries that we can look at the mechanisms and determine potentially what has occurred in that assault. It's a very interesting field and a challenging field. The type of injuries that we see and we're noticing in terms of family violence are blunt force injury, sharp force injury. So with blunt force, we're looking at head injuries in terms of, to give you extremes of things, cricket bats to the head, kicking, stomping, punching to all regions of the body. In terms of sharp force injuries, we're looking at knives and to the extremes of machetes. And these can produce very debilitating and permanent effects on the individuals that we see. One area in particular with family violence that we've noticed is the area of strangulation or non-fatal strangulation, which is a concerning mechanism given that it is a life-threatening mechanism. And unfortunately, for many of the victims we see, it's not an obvious mechanism of injury. So usually we'll examine an individual, we may not see that there has been any signs externally of this particular event. And that can be very difficult if you're taking this incident on towards court. So with the individuals that we see, the risk, particularly with non-fatal strangulation, is obviously death. Most recently, in the last 2 months, we've seen individuals that have had fractured hyoid bones, fractured larynxes, internal swelling, and all of these without detection early on, they can end up seeing Linda down the track, and that's very concerning. In terms of pushing forward from legislation, there is a push to have that as a separate form of a legal, I guess, term to use to a separate legislative event, which will be quite difficult to prove in terms of putting down these type of injuries and documenting them because they are so rare. When we examine these individuals on a regular basis in our clinic room downstairs, we see them, unfortunately, over and over again, the same individual. And then I've had the unfortunate opportunity, I guess you'd call it, to see a couple of young ladies in particular, and not that family violence is just part of a female problem. We see males and children as well. But I've seen a couple of young ladies downstairs that then have unfortunately moved on to the other side of the wall, which is in the mortuary. And that's something that we don't and we would like to prevent, and that's, I guess, a message that from the forensic perspective that we'd like to get across is that we don't want to see these type of injuries progressing to the other side, which is really quite shocking and not recognised, I don't think, enough. The other issue that we have in terms of clinical forensic medicine is the fact that we will see these individuals that have quite serious injuries, and unfortunately, like those that get documented in the news, where there's got death, and working with Jen, we've seen a lot of the cow punch get a lot of news headlines, and it's recognised, and the death is recognised, albeit devastating and horrible, but unfortunately the type of patients that we see don't get those headlines, and they come away with permanent debilitating injuries, and those numbers I just don't think are recognised enough, and given enough, I guess, energy for the messages that we're trying to get across in terms of prevention, because these poor people have their lives permanently changed, and that affects their family, affects themselves, and in the long term it affects the entire community, because these people may never get out of a rehabilitation state and make their way back to where they started, and that's quite disappointing.
Joe, I'm intrigued. You mentioned sort of the gender issue before.
Yep.
Can you give us a rough idea of statistics?
Can't give you exact sort of figures.
Not exact,
things, no, but what I mean, obviously we see a large number of females, and you know, you can't change it anyway other than that with family violence. But I guess the message that I want to give that it's not purely a problem of male on female. We do see males affected by this, and obviously the other important message is that children are heavily affected by family violence, heavily affected by the environment they're in, and alcohol stems this violence. We've heard from Linda, who tells us some of the effects, and particularly on the brain, in terms of ability to, or lose the ability to have that cognitive processes of insight and judgment. And once those are lost, you put individuals in that process whereby they can't see anything other than a violent way to solve their problem. And the strangulation is a message of that, basically. It's a power and control situation.
Yep.
It's a I can shut you up very quickly situation, and render you incapacitated very quickly. And I don't know whether we seem to, or we feel anecdotally that we're seeing such a huge increase in this non-fatal strangulation as a mechanism, but whether or not we're just detecting it more or asking the question more, and it may have been around as a method for a long time, but we are really noticing that as a modus operandi more and more.
And I want to double back just for a moment, question without notice, Jen, to you. Joe mentioned this, the Cowards Punch campaign, and that little, almost like a catch cry. It is something that the community is very, very aware of, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
I wonder why, I'm interested in why it's not captured our imagination. That's perhaps not the right way of describing it, but it is something. Maybe is it because it's a phrase or a catch cry?
Well, I think firstly it's quite shocking if you have seen a coward punch or one punch or king hit, as it used to be called.
Yes.
If you actually see live footage of one of those incidents that have been captured in the past, it's very confronting. It's also a split-second decision that somebody makes that not only usually ruins the life of the victim and the victim's family, but also the perpetrator.
Yes.
That's what's often neglected, I think, that often it is a really bad decision on the spot, often fueled by alcohol, and then they've got to live with the ramifications of that for the rest of their lives. Sometimes it means prison sentences, sometimes it doesn't. The victims that are lucky enough to survive these assaults often end up with permanent mental and physical disability. They never fully recover from one of these assaults. And so I think it is a very confronting kind of assault. It's happening a lot more in Australian society than I thought, and that a lot of other people thought it was. And
more recently, or?
Well, actually, since all of the campaigning and the research we've done, we are seeing some positive trends. So that's something that we're looking at the moment, and that we'll be releasing new findings of in the coming weeks and months. But we are seeing some promising data in that space. But I mean, even the terminology around it, it used to be called a king hit. And when we first published research on this topic back in 2013, that was the terminology used. And since it became a lot more, the awareness around Australia was raised a lot more around these kinds of assaults. The terminology changed. They want to sort of glorify the perpetrators by calling it a king hit. So that's where Coward Punch was born, and Danny Green, who is behind the Stop the Coward Punch Foundation, who we've been working with, did a lot of work to change that terminology in the Australian public. So I think a lot of the media around it, like Joe said, has meant that there's a lot more Australians aware of what a one punch or coward punch is now than ever before.
Well, I think it had that association with AFL, with that sort of the romantic, in a way, image of the tough guy, the enforcer who could do that. And it was almost rolling towards some sort of hero situation, the enforcer who would look after the other teams. But I think, look, we're getting off the topic here, but I don't know if anyone heard a fabulous interview recently with Fraser Gehrig, the St Kilda footballer, who was having a go at Triple M for the way they used to vote 3-2-1 for the worst players. And he absolutely held them to account. He said there's a lot of blokes who were depressed and this didn't help. So it feels like that we are getting away from this romantic image and we're starting to question. And you would hope that that happens on the sporting field and the ripple effect goes out. Let's move now to emergency work in hospitals and the role that alcohol plays there. Associate Professor Cunningham, like Dr. Parkin, you're truly at the coalface in the emergency department. Tell us about your day or night, what it's like, and the impact of alcohol.
Thank you, Brian. Well, I think it's fair to say that for my colleagues and I working in emergency departments, alcohol-related presentations really define a significant part of our work. Unfortunately, there wouldn't be a shift or a department where we didn't have a substantial number of patients there because of alcohol-related harm. The Australasian College for Emergency Medicine has actually acknowledged that alcohol-related harm is the largest preventable public health issue facing emergency departments in Australia and New Zealand. And we're now starting to see really good, important data to reflect what we've all been experiencing in emergency departments, and that's that the numbers are big. The members of the college have been doing some really good research where they've been doing what's called point prevalence studies. So they basically pick a single point in time and survey a bunch of emergency departments and determine what are the number of alcohol-related presentations that are present in the department at the time. And they've been doing this each year since 2016. So the most recent data, the 2019 data, shows that 13% of all presentations within an emergency department are there because of alcohol-related harm. So that's a big number, and that's been shown each year consistently. When we talk about alcohol-related harm, there's a wide range of presentations to hospital that we're really talking about. And we've heard some of the different types of harm that we see in society. I guess when we think about those presentations in emergency departments, we think about acute intoxication. So you imagine the person that's been brought in after a heavy session of drinking, and they're acutely intoxicated, they're behaviourally disturbed. And that certainly takes up a lot of our efforts and energy on a shift. But we also see a large number of patients that present with chronic alcohol-related harm. So they'll come in with presentations as a result of alcohol dependence or alcohol withdrawal states. And then there are all the presentations where alcohol is a contributing factor. So as Linda had talked about, other chronic diseases, so gastrointestinal diseases, heart diseases, cancers related to alcohol as well. Particularly in my emergency department, but I think reflected in most emergency departments, we see alcohol in association with other drugs of abuse. So often there's a multifactorial nature of somebody's behavioural disturbance or how they're presenting to hospital. And also what's called a dual diagnosis, where you see substance use, such as alcohol, coexisting with mental health problems. And these are really complex, difficult presentations where people can be extremely unwell. If we then look at another big area of alcohol-related harm, there are the broader social issues that might drive presentations to emergency departments, things such as homelessness, social isolation, financial strife. All of these can be the factors causing people needing to come to emergency departments. Again, Linda talked about some of the changes to the brain, the cognitive changes that we know happens when people drink. And so some of our presentations relate to developmental problems that people have, acquired brain injuries. And that may be acquired brain injuries as a result of trauma that's occurred at some stage in their life that may have been related to alcohol, or we may see developmental injuries and brain conditions relating to drinking that's occurred in pregnancy. And so what we're actually seeing are the downstream effects of that, where people have been born with fetal alcohol use spectrum disorders. So a lot of issues, not just the injuries that we see that result from poor decision-making or accidents or alcohol-fueled violence, but all these other chronic medical and mental health and social conditions as well. There are some stats that show that alcohol-related presentations account for roughly 430 hospital admissions in Australian hospitals every day, and that's possibly, an underestimation of what we see. So I guess that gives you an idea of what it looks like. And when we talk about the impact of all of that, obviously there's a significant impact on patients who are dealing with their complex health needs. But I think it's really important also to acknowledge the impact on staff and on families and on other carers and people working in hospitals, in emergency departments, because what we do see with alcohol-related presentations is we see an increased risk of violence as well. There was a very good bit of research done a few years ago by Professor Edgerton Warburton, an emergency physician, who showed that 98% of clinical staff in emergency departments had experienced verbal aggression as a result of alcohol-related presentations. That's almost 100% of patients with alcohol-related presentations. 92% had experienced physical aggression. And, I can say from personal experience, I've experienced both verbal and physical aggression from patients that I've cared for who've presented with alcohol-related issues. There's also the significant economic burden, so that the cost of caring for patients with alcohol-related harm in emergency departments. I think one estimate is approximately $630 per emergency department presentation. Again, I think that's probably an underestimate. And for a lot of these patients, we see repeated presentations time and time again with their chronic illnesses and their chronic complex health needs. So we're talking about very intensive needs in terms of time, very intensive needs in terms of resources to care for these patients properly. As a personal reflection, the other thing I've noticed in the 15 to 20 years now that I've worked in an emergency department, I see younger and younger people presenting with chronic alcohol-related issues, so not just the acute intoxication, but the repeated presentations with alcohol dependence and alcohol withdrawal. So the impact, as I said, is enormous, and it is a crisis for emergency departments.
And it's not getting better.
No, it's not getting better.
You'd say it's getting worse.
Yes, I think we'll continue to see these point prevalence studies done by these emergency medicine researchers, and we'll get a really good idea of what's happening each year, but certainly it's not getting better.
It's terrible. You mentioned that figure, I think it was 13% of all admissions are connected to alcohol abuse. Are there other areas that are similarly large?
I'm not sure.
Probably not.
Yeah.
That's a uniting or a unifying factor for a large percentage.
That's right. I mean, it's a very big number for a single toxic agent, causative effect.
I know our focus is on alcohol tonight, but I'm continually hearing from friends and associates, and I read in the newspaper, people with perhaps using ice or using amphetamines. That must be a factor in emergency rooms too.
Yes, that would be a long conversation for another day. But yes,
it's worth
absolutely
noting it.
And what we see, what's really concerning is that we're seeing a lot of this mixed presentation as well. We're seeing people drinking alcohol who are also using methamphetamine, and when you introduce methamphetamine into hospital presentations, the level of violence increases very significantly.
That's the trouble. It instantly seems to jump to aggression, doesn't it? And violence.
Yes.
Brian, the other thing that we're still hasn't quite played out yet is that last year, with various lockdowns in Melbourne and throughout the state, and statistics that I think show that alcohol consumption increased dramatically, I don't think we've seen how that's going to flow through.
Really?
And what the consequences of that's going to be, because there will be changes in people's habits. And the point was made before about the generational impact on this, that children who have seen their parents drinking to excess and perhaps drug use as well in the mix are drinking earlier, and therefore their chronic health problems are becoming earlier. And the things you see in the emergency wards throughout the state, in some sense, they're the lucky ones because they don't come and see Linda or I. And that's unfortunately the trajectory. I think most of the people that we see being admitted here into the morgue would have had 1, 2, 3, 5 presentations in emergency departments somewhere else. So it's a trajectory, and the lucky ones don't end up dead, but unfortunately, a significant number aren't and don't avoid it.
Absolutely. Let's stay with you, John. We're sort of tying up a few ends at this point. John and also Nicola Cunningham, Associate Professor Cunningham. Between your two roles, you do see the full spectrum of these issues. Some solutions, or some not necessarily solutions, because that's too easy. What do we need to do next, do you think, to address this really absolutely crucial public health issue? Let's start with you, John.
Look, I think the starting point in my mind is that most of these deaths are preventable. And if you look at the coroner's remit, it's about identifying ways to reduce the number of deaths that occur. So are they preventable and what can you do? And if you look at a range of other public education and information campaigns that occurred, we saw the ad from the TAC at the start, which is a very good example of the way a public education campaign has run to highlight the problems of drink driving. And I think the evidence is very clear that it has significant impact. But there's other examples. The campaigns that have been run about heart health through the Heart Foundation have been successful. Probably the most successful has been around smoking rates. The information, now that was combined with restrictions and information around sale, and I don't think as a community we're up for that yet, but there are some lessons I think that we can learn from the anti-tobacco campaigns around those things. And gambling, there's education campaign there. There's just not much of it happening with alcohol. And I think there is a real opportunity to do a whole lot more in providing information to people to, in effect, balance a bit the very positive image that's given to having a drink with friends and it's a great thing to do and it's a social thing and aren't we all having a good time? Sure, that's right. When it's consumed moderately, that's fine. That group isn't the problem. The problem is the group that moved from social drinking and drinking in moderation to drinking to excess and accessing it through bulk buying at packaged liquor outlets. So I think the other thing that we could probably do is a bit more research around what is the purchasing or buying patterns of people in the community and what volumes and quantities of alcohol are they buying and the consumption rates. I think that information might help inform a public information and education campaign, because I think there are large chunks of the community who are chronic drinkers who don't understand fully the damage that they're doing. And the other part of it, I think, is that for every person that has a chronic drinking problem, somebody else, their friends, family or others know about it. I suspect the problem that those people face is they don't know what to do about it. So how do they access help? Who do they go and talk to? What do they do to provide some sort of assistance to that person? Because I'm sure they'd be willing to do it. They just don't have enough information to be able to assist and support them. So I think there's things we can do around that. And you know, the responsible serving of alcohol process that's been around for 20 years, I think has fixed, in many respects, the consumption of alcohol in pubs and clubs and restaurants. I think it has toned it down. That's not, you know, one punch cases still do occur, I accept that, and they do occur out of those places, but that has managed it. We don't have an equivalent campaign or process for selling liquor for consumption off premises. Now, I don't know what the answer to that is precisely, but I think given the cost that hospitals, that the community pays for excessive consumption of alcohol, it'd be a very small but worthwhile investment to try and understand that better and do a whole lot more to educate, inform and provide some pathways for people who are chronic alcohol consumers to get out of that and break that cycle.
Well, as you say, the smoking campaign, the heart health, the general fitness campaigns, these are almost altruistic of themselves. The alcohol one, sure, the TAC ads are very effective, but they're all connected with driving. There doesn't seem to be something that is simply related to alcohol. And I would imagine that there's probably a pretty good argument that says that it's something to do with our culture, this idea of, again, romanticising the idea of alcohol. How do you think we stack up in terms of alcohol? And I'm going to throw this to all of you, with other countries. Linda?
Well, I can actually reflect on my experience working in Scotland, in Glasgow.
Yep.
And I have to say, the alcohol problem in that part of the world is worse than here.
It's chronic, yes. I've just finished reading Shuggie Bain.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so...
Very powerful.
And are they addressing it in a manner that John might be happy with?
Well, it's interesting because I think the Scottish Government is looking at minimum alcohol pricing, and that took a lot of doing in terms of the sort of alcohol production industry and things. But when you can get really, really cheap, nasty alcohol, that it can make a significant difference.
Right.
So, but I think this is the type of thing that's going to have to look over years and decades to see if it's really going to make an impact on people's drinking culture.
Okay, Jo?
I think what I've noticed is that over the lockdown period and internationally as well, it became very cool to be talking about drinking early in the day.
Yes.
On social media, it was a big thing. Oh, have you had your glass of wine at 10 a.m. in the morning yet? And it was a real
badge of honour.
Yeah, it was a badge of honour to do that. And I think it's almost promoted that, again, unfortunately, John, to see that it is a cool thing to do. And it doesn't help our situation. And as you say, with celebrities particularly providing that avenue for entertainment purposes, with which a lot are on the social media during that lockdown period, it hasn't helped. And it'd be interesting, as John says, how much were people consuming over that time period, ordering it to be Uber delivered, and what change have we seen over that time? And I know anecdotally they were saying that purchasing over that time period has increased significantly, but it would be interesting to see what those figures are.
Jen, your experience, and I suppose we're thinking tonight of this idea of the coward punch. What about other countries?
Well, actually, after we first published some of this research, I was contacted by people in California and also in Ireland who were quite interested in the data because they've said they have similar problems there. However, ours was the first study and still remains the only study looking at one punch assault specifically globally. So there hasn't been anything else published on this topic specifically, but we know that this kind of assault does happen in other places.
Anecdotally, you must be aware of it. Is it somehow connected to the pubs and the sporting events and family violence? So much family violence, maybe.
Yeah, the trends that we're seeing might actually be changing in that space. So we did see a lot more of these assaults happening in pubs and clubs since the awareness programs around this space. That might be changing. Still not fixed, but might be improving. I mean, there are other countries. I spent quite a lot of time working in Sweden, and they've got a completely different approach to alcohol over there. It's much more restricted. They don't sell alcohol at supermarkets and bottle-os and wine cellars and all sorts of places like we do here. They have one central shop that's throughout Sweden, but it's the only place that you can buy alcohol. They've got very strict hours, only during the daytime and Saturday mornings. They're closed Saturday afternoons, closed Sundays, and the alcohol prices are considerably higher than what we see here. So obviously alcohol has been a problem in the Scandinavian countries for quite some time, but that's how Sweden's managing it. And they're quite progressive in terms of their health and medical research and intervention. So it seems to be working more positively over there.
Well, we're seeing a connection with what's happening in Scotland and Glasgow, and in a way you could draw a parallel with the rise in price of tobacco. I mean, it's incredibly prohibitive now.
Exactly. And also that's an example of something that's taken decades for that cultural change to happen. It's not something that, you know, the interventions were put in place and they were expecting results within a few years. That's taken sort of 30 years to change that culture in Australia. So that's something we need to get started on alcohol in Australia now.
Nicola, we might let you have the last word on that final question that I asked before. What do we do next, from your point of view, to address this public health issue?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, we know it's such a complex issue that affects so many different facets of society. It's not going to be one clear, simple solution.
Of course.
And there's different areas that need to be addressed. And I think broadly, we've touched on all of them. We need to look at how you reduce the demand, and that's about changing the culture, changing how people see alcohol, what the drinking patterns are, what the advertising is for it, and you know, reversing some of what happened during lockdown in terms of the culture. And then changing supply, and you know, that's something that's a big conversation to be had in other forums about how you regulate supply of alcohol to people. And then from the point of view of medicine, so within emergency departments, our focus needs to be on how do we reduce the harm. And as John talked about, we need to really look at primary prevention. That's the best way to prevent it. And we do that by continuing to collect good data, by finding ways to introduce interventions, focused, effective interventions in the emergency department, increasing resourcing to manage presentations. So that's, you know, physical resourcing like beds, like space, like staffing, but also resourcing in terms of building multidisciplinary supports for these patients, because it's not just about the medical care, it's about, you know, the counselling and the social work and the occupational therapy and everything else that needs to be built up around them to help them manage and reverse these health issues, and then improving the integration and the resourcing between emergency departments and alcohol and other drug services is going to be really important moving forwards.
Yep. All righty, we are running out of time. The clock on the wall says it's time for dinner. So I want to be a little informal now and thank all of you for your, not only your honesty, but also your skill levels. So thank you, Nicola, Joe, Linda, John and Jen. If you can pardon the pun, this has been a sobering experience, certainly for me, and I'm sure for most of our audience. We've heard about the dangers of alcohol, how these wonderful people go about their work, the role of the coronial system, the fascinating forensics that provide scientific insights, and the public health areas where prevention initiatives are certainly needed. Thanks for being with us again this year for another great Law Week event at the Coroners Court. Stay safe, look after each other. Let's hope we see each other next year in person. I'm Brian Nankervis. Thank you and good night. And we wave.
Julie.
Very nice. Cheers.
What's Julie, mate? Can you hear me? Talk to me. What's your first name? Just keep looking straight ahead there.
There's
no dad. There's no way I could have been that scared.
Well, I'll never see her again.
Will we get going?
Yeah.
Never hear her voice.
Happy birthday, Dad.
Thanks, sweetheart.
No worries.
hear her laugh.
Take care of my baby girl.
I will.
I'll never see her getting married.
Sure you don't want me to drive?
I'm all right. I've only had a few. Besides, been eating your mum's food all day.
Cuddle her children.
She was here. Where is she?
I'll never hear her call me Dad. And I'll never forget having to choose a coffin. For my beautiful baby.